Some neighbors here had complained of a stench for almost a year, but they never imagined what might be causing it. Milwaukee police were led to an apartment in this building after they were flagged down by a handcuffed man who claimed he had been attacked. What they discovered upon their arrival was almost unspeakable. Numerous pieces from as many as 15 human bodies, including 3 heads, preserved in a refrigerator.
It's obvious that there has been a number of human specimens found within the apartment, and to a certain extent they have been there sometime.
A hazardous materials team, breathing from air tanks, confiscated a number of items from the suspect's apartment. Among them, police say, photographs and drawings of dead, mutilated bodies and a vat of acid. Police believe the suspect may have used the acid to dissolve body parts. Neighbors also say they heard sawing in the apartment at all hours of the day and night.
In the news this morning, on a serious note, police in Wisconsin this morning are investigating a grisly discovery in a Milwaukee apartment, the discovery of pieces of bodies. Police found parts of as many as 15 human bodies inside. Police were led there by a man who told them he'd been attacked with a butcher knife.
On to the news desk. Ann?
Thanks, Brian. In the news this morning, a 31-year-old man in Milwaukee has reportedly confessed to killing at least 11 men and to practicing cannibalism. Police on Tuesday found numerous body parts in the man's apartment, as well as a dresser full of photographs and drawings of mutilated bodies. Investigators believe that as many as 15 men may have been killed. Police are still trying to identify the numerous murder victims found in a local apartment. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 31-year-old tenant, is in custody and has confessed to killing the 11 people found in his apartment and maybe more.
Milwaukee police told Catherine Lacey last night her 23-year-old son Oliver, who vanished 2 weeks ago, is dead.
It's really puzzling to me.
Her son's remains were the first to be identified from the severed skulls and limbs taken from this apartment building Monday night. Later today, 31-year-old chocolate factory worker Jeffrey Dahmer will be charged with Lacey's murder, and more charges are sure to follow.
There are 11 individuals or parts thereof that were recovered, and those would include 11 intact skulls. He just said that I'm the one responsible for what I have done.
Dahmer's attorney says his client is confessing to up to 18 murders over the past several years because it's time to tell the truth.
This is a very sick young man who has many kind of mental problems.
Jeffrey Dahmer remains jailed on $1 million bond while his attorney prepares an expected insanity defense.
It's a frightening thought indeed. Dr. John Hunter is with us now from affiliate WAVY in Norfolk, Virginia for some answers. He is the Director of Behavioral Studies at the Pines Treatment Center there. Good morning.
Good morning.
Was there any way, sir, to detect that Jeffrey Dahmer's criminal behavior was going to progress the way it did?
Well, I think that it's important to note that most people who are sexual offenders do not progress to the point that they actually commit homicide. I think it's relatively rare. But the thing that I heard that was very important is that there were signs that the problem was there from an early age. It's very rare for an adult to begin to sexually act out as an adult. It usually begins as a juvenile.
When he was released from prison after he served time for child, his father pleaded for treatment, and there's no evidence that he actually got any. Is that unusual for a convicted to receive treatment?
It's not at all unusual. In fact, most offenders go undetected, and then they are either never referred to treatment, or the kind of treatment that they're referred to is not specialized enough to be effective. Most people who go to prison simply do not receive the kind of treatment in prison that they need, or they receive no treatment at all. And then once they're out of prison, it's simply they're a free person, and they don't have any therapy at that point either.
In the news this morning, the work of identifying human remains continues in Milwaukee as police press on their investigation of a ghastly multiple murder. Meanwhile, prime suspect Jeffrey Dahmer is being linked to mysterious deaths in other states and perhaps overseas. More from Paul Hogan.
Is that correct? That's correct, Your Honor.
Jeffrey Dahmer told the judge he understood the murder charges lodged against him, and though he appeared calm and unemotional, his attorney says he's actually distraught.
He's a very desperate young man. He is very troubled, and he is in a high, anxious mood because of what has happened.
The
suspect may well have been involved in at least 17 homicides.
Police say they've widened their murder probe to include every place Dahmer ever lived or visited. Illinois, Ohio, Florida, even Germany, where 5 unsolved dismemberment slayings occurred in the early 80s when Dahmer was an army private stationed there.
The information we received has ranged over a period of that time. At least.
6 of Dahmer's victims have already been identified, and the coroner here believes 4 more should be identified by later today.
Officials in other states and at least one other country have some grim questions about a suspect being held in Milwaukee. Jeffrey Dahmer has been formally charged with the deaths of 4 people, but police say he's been linked to many more murders. He's said to have confessed to killing 11 men, and the investigation is even widening to Germany. That's where Dahmer served in the U.S. Army in the early 1980s. Investigators in Ohio have gone to work on reports that the bloody legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer may have begun there more than a dozen years ago. Dahmer has already admitted to killing 11 people whose remains were found in his Milwaukee apartment last week.
Pastor Dean Nelson spent his Sunday trying to heal the wounds of the past week. Nelson's church is just 7 blocks from Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment.
What makes this particular incident such a tragedy is that it seems that all along Mr. Dahmer's life there could have been ways of intercepting and changing what has grown to be such a great tragedy.
While he prayed for the victims and their families, Pastor Nelson said the pain extends much further, encompassing the entire Milwaukee area and more. But while they preach, the story continues to take on new and tragic dimensions. Police in Ohio say Dahmer confessed to killing a 19-year-old hitchhiker in their state back in 1978. They say Dahmer identified Stephen Hicks as the man he killed at his parents' house near Akron. A human bone was found on the property where Dahmer lived with his parents 13 years ago. Ohio investigators plan to dig up the yard tomorrow to search for more remains. Hicks is believed to be the first victim in what became a string of murders and mutilations.
Investigators today turned up more than 24 human bone parts in the yard of Jeffrey Dahmer's boyhood home in Ohio. But Dahmer is accused of doing most of his killing in Milwaukee, and people there are starting to ask the police some hard questions.
Why wasn't Dahmer arrested sooner, before he had a chance to murder as many as 17 people, most of them gay African Americans? There's a lot of anger and suspicion among both groups.
We want somebody that's going to investigate the police department. You didn't say nothing about this white boy over here killing us over here.
Not only were these men the victims of a mass murderer, but also of a police department that did not even notice.
By the time police found the remains of 11 victims in his apartment, the authorities had encountered Jeffrey Dahmer several times. He was convicted in 1989 of assaulting a boy. After Dahmer was paroled, his father wrote a letter to the judge, urging him to get help for his son. Then, little more than 2 months ago, the neighbors called police when this 14-year-old, a brother of the boy Dahmer, was seen running naked and bleeding from Dahmer's apartment. The police returned the boy to Dahmer after he said they were lovers. The boy's body was among those found in the apartment. A growing number of minority groups in other cities are tired of waiting for the police to act. They are taking the law into their own hands. Police officials admit officers are usually more responsive to complaints from white, more affluent neighborhoods.
The wealthy person is more likely to be an articulate person. They're more likely to be one that the officer thinks is going to follow through. The officer may also think that they're going to be more likely to complain if it isn't handled by the book.
In Ohio, the search continues in and around the boyhood home of accused multiple killer Jeffrey Dahmer. More than 50 pieces of bone have been discovered. The local county coroner says 70% of the bones appear to be human. Dahmer is in jail in Milwaukee, where police say he has confessed to 17 killings. 8 more murder charges have been filed against accused multiple killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer, who has admitted 17 killings, now stands formally charged with 12 of them. A judge in Milwaukee has also raised his bail to $5 million. Veteran television newsman Harry Reisner has died in Connecticut, indicted on rape charges. Tyson says he's innocent of the charges. Milwaukee mass murder suspect Jeffrey Dahmer has pleaded innocent by reason of insanity to 15 murder counts. Relatives of some of his victims were in the courtroom.
I think that he knew exactly what he was doing and how he was going to do it. There's nothing wrong with Jeffrey Dahmer.
Jeffrey Dahmer pleaded guilty to killing 15 young men. Under Wisconsin law, there must now be a sanity hearing. Police detectives who took Jeffrey Dahmer's confession will continue their testimony at his sanity trial. As testimony began on Thursday, a prosecutor said Dahmer carefully chose his victims for his fantasies of sex and death. Dahmer has admitted killing and dismembering 15 young men, but his lawyers insist he was mentally ill and tried to control his compulsions. In Florida, Eileen Wuornos hears her life or death sentence today. In Milwaukee, the Jeffrey Dahmer sanity trial could go to jury today. The jury will decide if Dahmer should go to prison or to a mental institution for the murders of 15 people. His lawyer says Dahmer won't take the stand himself. The case against Jeffrey Dahmer comes to a close today when he is sentenced later this morning in a Milwaukee courtroom.
Did the defendant, Jeffrey L. Dahmer, have a mental disease? Answer, no.
After 2 weeks of disturbing testimony, the jury found Dahmer legally sane when he murdered and dismembered his 15 victims over a 13-year period. He enters the prison sentence system. Will he be in solitary confinement, do you believe?
Well, I would think so. There's some concern about suicide. Obviously, that concern has prevailed since the time of his arrest. I think there will also be concern how he might be received by the prisoner population. It's difficult to assess that. He suffers from what's called a paraphilia, intense sexual urges and fantasies. It's something he never dealt with. We offered him that opportunity when he was first convicted of indecent exposure in our community. He rejected that psychological help. I think people are willing to accept a type of insanity defense where there's a genuine separation from reality. This type of disorder that this man has, a sexual disorder, does not put him out of contact with reality in any sense of the word.
Love in Black and White. Brian's back with the story of the rise in interracial marriages. But first, serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer for a sentencing hearing. Over the weekend, the jury ruled that Dahmer was sane when he murdered and dismembered 15 young men. He faces a mandatory sentence of life in prison for each killing.
Some real-life drama today in a Milwaukee courtroom. Serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms without parole in the killings of 15 young men and boys. The sentencing followed courtroom statements from relatives of the victims and from Dahmer himself.
Never, Jeffrey! Jeffrey! You took my mother's oldest grandchild from her, and for that I can never forgive you. I hope you can deal with what you've done.
And for the first time, Dahmer spoke publicly about the murders.
This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. I feel so bad for what I did to those poor families, and I understand their rightful hate. I know I will be in prison for the rest of my life. I know that I will have to turn to God to help me get through each day. I should have stayed with God. I tried and failed and created a Holocaust.
Dahmer said if it would bring back those he killed, he would give his own life right now.
Jeffrey Dahmer. Though few were mourning his death, the fact that he was murdered by another inmate while he was behind bars is a source of concern to the man who oversees Wisconsin's prison system. What can you tell us, sir, about Christopher Scarver, the man you're holding in connection with Dahmer's death? Has he yet been officially charged?
He has not yet been officially charged.
Do you yet have a motive in the death of Dahmer?
No, we are waiting for the Columbia Sheriff's Department.
You're not discounting the possibility that he was part of some larger conspiracy?
I never discount anything. Again, I do not believe it was a conspiracy. He had been in a status in the housing unit he was in where he could leave the housing unit to go to a job situation and do that work, which would mean that he would not be continuously supervised.
Help me again on the timing here. He was supposedly escorted into the gymnasium area where he was killed at about 7:50. Reportedly, his body was found at about 8:10. During those 15 minutes, where were the staff personnel who were supposed to be watching over him?
At this time, I do not have exact information on whereabouts and activities of staff who were in the gymnasium at that particular time. That is being determined by the investigating sheriff's department.
Jesse Anderson also sustained injuries in the attack. Do you know of any relationship between Anderson and Dahmer?
No, I do not. I met with Mr. Anderson's family last night, and there is no connection that they are aware of or that I am aware of.
Bottom line, Mr. Sullivan, do you or other prisoners protect whom, or should we view this as the natural consequence of a man like Dahmer being locked up with unnamed people?
I certainly do not consider this a national consequence. I consider this a real tragedy. It is something that we did not expect.
Continue their investigation into Monday's killing of mass murderer Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer was serving multiple life terms for killing and dismembering 17 beaten to death Monday in prison. There was strong reaction from relatives of some of his victims.
That I am happy and very excited